Our next presentation, Veterans and Traumatic Brain Injury. Justice Evelyn Lundberg Stratton and Dr. Rita Wood will lead this part of the presentation. Justice Stratton joined the Vorys Columbus office after serving 16 years as a justice at the Supreme Court of Ohio and 7 years as a trial court judge in Franklin County. While serving at the Supreme Court, she led the way for Ohio in the Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Mental Illness and was instrumental in establishing Ohio's 45 mental health courts. She is joined today by Dr. Rita Wood. Dr. Wood is the Mental Health Program Manager for Northeast Ohio VA Healthcare System. She is the outpatient clinical lead for PTS and is the co-lead for the Primary Care Mental Health Integration Program. Together, they will be addressing traumatic brain injury, or TBI. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to briefly set the stage for Dr. Rita Wood. I became interested very early on working with the VA, VJOs and establishing veterans courts on the issue of traumatic brain injury, which was very misunderstood, not even recognized in many places. It first started with football, and it took a long time, even now, to recognize football, traumatic brain injury. But the type of brain injury that veterans suffer is even more dramatic because it affects the whole brain with the shock waves. So I worked with a Dr. Chrisanne Gordon, who had her own TBI, to get the foundation called Resurrecting Lives up, dealing with TBI. We've engaged in studies. I've been working with OSU to try to establish a veterans TBI center, because so many times we think of it as PTSD. We don't recognize it's an actual physical injury to the brain, and the symptoms are often similar or in many cases worse, and you have to treat it very differently and often more expensively. And so we want to make sure that the audience really understands the difference between PTSD and TBI, although you almost always have PTSD if you have TBI, and to be able to recognize the symptoms and to be able to deal appropriately. Fortunately, I was connected with Dr. Rita Wood, who can give you a much better explanation with the medical and clinical background than I can. So I was very relieved that I didn't have to do the whole presentation, and I could punt it over to Dr. Wood, who has some wonderful slides and some great explanations of the injury itself and then how it connects with veterans. So Dr. Wood, take it away.
Yes, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Justice Stratton. I appreciate that introduction. And as Justice Stratton indicated, PTSD and TBI often go together. A lot of people don't have a very good understanding of traumatic brain injury, and over the last several years, there's been more research and a lot more awareness regarding traumatic brain injury. There are many common events that can occur to cause a traumatic brain injury. Someone could fall, hit their head on an object. There can be a vehicle collision, violence, sports injuries. As Justice Stratton mentioned, football is a big one, also soccer for concussions. Explosive blasts and other combat injuries. Explosive blasts seem to be the most common cause of traumatic brain injury in our active duty military personnel, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the statistics with that. But also, traumatic brain injury is not just a closed head injury, it can also be an open-headed injury. This means that there's a penetrating wound. There could be a severe blow to the head with shrapnel or debris, or when the head hits an object, there can be an open wound. Those are much more recognizable, but we don't see them as often. We see more of the closed-headed injuries. The next slide, the risk of traumatic brain injury. So our military service members are much more likely to be exposed to IEDs, suicide bombers, landmines, mortar rounds, or rocket-propelled grenades, and this can lead to those brain injuries. Between 2000 and 2014, more than 300,000 veterans were diagnosed with a mild traumatic brain injury. Those are some staggering numbers. But I also wanted to point out that in the general public, in the criminal justice system, 50 to 80% of those individuals in the criminal justice system also have a traumatic brain injury. And women tend to have a higher incidence of traumatic brain injury once they're in the criminal justice system. And as we know, women are more likely to be victims of violent crimes, so that could account for that large number. And in the general public, a traumatic brain injury, less than 5% of people have that. So I just wanted to give those numbers for you to understand how much more prevalent in the criminal justice system traumatic brain injuries are. And then often what goes along with TBI is a mental health illness. Again, Justice Stratton mentioned PTSD. That's a very common one. Substance abuse is also, there's a much higher incidence of substance abuse and trauma for these individuals, which makes it difficult for them to think. They have poor judgment and they have poor impulse control. And those are the problems that can lead to them being part of the criminal justice system. And as we know, the criminal justice system can be a revolving door. And it's very interesting that Mr. Hunter presented earlier, because I was going to bring up a story that I had read about in the brain defense, where he had defended a Minnesota veteran. This veteran had served in Iraq and had a traumatic brain injury along with PTSD. He had gotten caught up in the criminal justice system because of domestic violence with his significant other. And he had reached out to Mr. Hunter for assistance, knowing that Mr. Hunter had helped other veterans. And he didn't want to become one of those statistics and be part of the revolving door and be in trouble. As we know, the criminal justice system can be overwhelming for individuals. They don't always understand it. There's a lot of things that go on. They need assistance. And when you have a traumatic brain injury and you have poor judgment, you can't think through what's going on. You need more assistance than the typical person would need. And then they get in more trouble because of that poor impulse control. They're more likely to get in fights. They're more likely to get in trouble at work. They're more likely to get in trouble with a significant other or a spouse, drunk driving. Those are all issues that can land them in the criminal justice system. Some of the other disorders that go along with TBI, as mentioned earlier, suicide is a huge issue, again, because they have poor impulse control and they don't think things through because of their poor judgment. They're more likely to commit suicide. They're more likely to have pain disorders because of whatever traumatic injury that they suffered. They may have hit something. And I had a veteran with a TBI who he was in his late 20s, but he had to use a cane to walk. His body, when he had experienced a blast, had been thrown and he could no longer walk and had multiple surgeries. So he had to use the assistance of a cane and he had constant pain. So because of these things, having TBI, having PTSD, having medical issues requiring the use of a cane, he had a lower quality of life. He knew what he was like before he went into the military, and he couldn't function the same once he left the military. And so this caused problems with depression. He had suicidal thoughts, and it's very difficult to engage these individuals in treatment, especially younger veterans, because they think that they just need to work, they need to be busy, they need to do things to keep themselves on track. But once they get in trouble, that's when they end up in the criminal justice system, and often when they end up coming to the VA for assistance. And as I mentioned before, because of the impulse control problems, because of the poor judgment, there's a causal link between TBI and criminal behavior, or making poor decisions. It doesn't mean that the TBI causes them to act that way, but it does play a factor in how they end up in the criminal justice system. As I mentioned before, my veteran, he knew how he was before he went into the military, and then he knew he was different when he left the military, which was extremely frustrating for him. He couldn't do the same things as before. These behavior changes, these personality changes, these thought patterns, they could be temporary depending on the type of injury they had, but the more injuries they have, or if it was more traumatic, injury, the less likely the brain is going to recover fully from that. And I do have a pretty dramatic example of that. I don't know if anyone has heard of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is considered to be a medical miracle. In mid-1800s, he worked on a railroad. He helped with building the railroads, blasting out the rock. He was a foreman. So there was documentation about his behavior from people who knew him prior to the accident and what he was like after it. And what happened is there was an explosion, and the tamping iron that you see him holding in his hands actually went through his brain. And it's a miracle that this happened in the mid-1800s and that he survived such an accident. They said he was a wonderful foreman, he was a smart businessman, he was well-tempered, he got along well with others, but after his accident, he became irreverent, he became fitful, he became grossly profane, meaning he'd use bad language around other individuals, didn't care about the people around him, and he wasn't able to keep his job. So unfortunately, he was fired, but because he was a medical miracle, he actually went around the country with his tamping iron, posing for people and telling about his story. But that is a dramatic example of how someone changed drastically after having traumatic brain injury. And if you'd like to look more up about that, I would suggest doing so because it is a very interesting story. The next slide, I just have a picture of what it's like for someone when they have a car accident. And as you can see, when a person has a vehicle collision, them being thrown forward and their brain hitting the front part and then being thrown backwards. And those red spots indicate where damage could be done to the brain from that sort of force. Our brain sits in a bunch of fluid inside of our skull. And so when you have that kind of force, it causes damage by the brain hitting the skull. And some of that can repair itself depending on the type of injury. And sometimes those effects could be long-term. Okay. My next few slides highlight the different signs of TBI. So these are some of the physical signs that people may have. They may have a headache, they may have difficulty sleeping, or they may sleep more than usual, dizziness, balance problems, the vomiting, drowsiness, sensitivity to light, ringing in the ears, and problems with speech. Again, some of these can be temporary after experiencing a head injury, or they could be more long-term. The cognitive issues that individuals have, as I mentioned before, is concentration problems, memory problems, slurred speech, and confusion. These kinds of issues, when they're long-term, can cause problems in individuals' daily living. If you're not able to concentrate, you can't understand what people are saying to you. You can't remember what people are saying to you. And then when you're trying to speak with individuals, if you can't get the words out, then these individuals tend to become frustrated. My veteran that I mentioned earlier, he would often have problems with concentrating. He would lose his thought and he would become very frustrated. Or if his thoughts were moving too fast, he couldn't keep up and he would start to slur words or not be able to say things properly, which would be very upsetting for him, and he wouldn't want to be around other individuals because he didn't want them to see him like that. And then the emotional signs that come along with TBI are irritability, anxiety, depression, mood swings, and anger. On my next slide, I just wanted to give you a viewpoint of what it's like for someone who has TBI and PTSD. Again, as stated before, TBI and PTSD tend to be very common together based on what the individual experienced. So what's unique to PTSD is the flashbacks and nightmares. And what's unique to TBI is headache and dizziness. And everything that you see in the middle is the combined poor concentration, the memory impairment, sleep disturbance, depression, anxiety, and irritability. And some of us have experienced this on a temporary basis. Sleep disturbance is one of the things that we've all, I'm sure, encountered at one time. And when you don't get a good night's sleep, the next morning you tend not to be able to think very well. You tend to be more irritable. Things that wouldn't bother you may bother you or make you angry. But knowing this, you're able to get past that and deal with it. Okay, I just had a bad night's sleep. I'm having a rougher day. I'm going to make sure I get better sleep the next night. Individuals with TBI and PTSD, this is cumulative. They experience this all of the time. This is their daily experience, and this is why it makes it much more difficult for them to function and to get along with others, to be able to function in their job, to be able to interact with their significant others or family members. And living this on a day-to-day basis is extremely overwhelming. And it's no wonder that most of them decide that they don't want to be around other people. They don't like being around other people, and their interactions tend not to go very well, and they get upset very easily. So because of all of these things that occur with these veterans, we do have a lot of services. As Mr. Hunter had indicated earlier, the VA is very much invested in taking care of our veterans. And so veterans who have traumatic brain injury, every VA medical center has a polytrauma center. And there is a variety of services that are offered, a variety of disciplines that work with the veterans when they're engaged with the polytrauma center. They'll work with them regarding prosthetics, like my veteran needing a cane to be able to walk. They will work with them about memory and concentration. What are some strategies that you use to help make you function better on a day-to-day basis? Working on the mood disorders, the anger and the depression. You're not the same person that you were before, but you can still do some of the same things. You just have to do it a different way. And so this is what the Polytrauma Center tries to work with the veterans on, tries to help them and their family members understand that the veteran is not the same person as they were before, and they need to learn and to do things differently than what they did in the past. The same thing that most people use, the same strategies, is not going to work for them. There needs to be some modifications. And also what had been mentioned earlier is that each medical center has a justice outreach initiative. So there are a variety of social workers that work with the veterans courts. They work with the veterans and their families. They help them to navigate that system. As you recall, I'd mentioned earlier, the justice system can be overwhelming and confusing. And so the job of these social workers is to help mitigate those, to help them to understand what's going on, to get them linked with services. As was stated before, a lot of times our veterans don't get engaged with the VA until they are in trouble in some way. And so this is a way to get them into our system, to get them the help that they need. I also listed Justice for Vets as another avenue to help veterans who are involved in the criminal system. There are a variety of resources. I just picked out a few. Certainly, I'm sure there'll be some more that are mentioned during the day today. And also what I listed as some resources for you to look at. I had mentioned the Braden Defense earlier. I thought that was a wonderful resource, and it talks about traumatic brain injury and individuals being caught up in the criminal justice system and how they need differences and how they're treated in order to be successful and not be caught up in that revolving door.